So welcome to the first session. Hopefully you all enjoyed Heather's keynote this morning. We are thrilled to be here for our conference, celebrating not just the last 20 years, but the next 5 years of our center. So we're all still kind of excited about that. And we are here this morning to talk about classroom systems. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about kind of the big picture, and then I'm going to introduce Cassandra, who's going to talk to you about an example of what it actually looks like in practice. So my name is Brandi Simonsen. I am at the University of Connecticut as a professor of special education and the new co-director of our national center. So this is really fun work, and the classroom piece is a passion of mine. But it's also nice to see, as you will this morning, how it fits into the broader work of PBIS. Okay. So as you go through every session, there are going to be some common slides you see. So Lucille prompted these this morning. We will do them a little bit slow in the first session. They'll get faster every session after this. But they're your cues to think about how you're going to use the information from this session and take it back. So think about whether you're here in the very beginning of implementation, whether you've been doing this for 5 years or more and things are fully installed and you're just refining practices, or whether you're somewhere in between. Think about what are the takeaways you're hoping to get from this session. So what are the few things you're wanting to walk away from? And then what did you actually walk away with after the session? And more importantly than that, what are you going to do with it? So how are you going to take it back? How are you going to use it to make change in your setting? So just so we know who's in the room, how many of you would say you're kind of at the beginning stage of PBIS, either in your school or you personally? All right, so a lot of us. How many of you have been here doing this for quite a while? So let's say at least 2 or 3 years, but maybe even beyond that. Great. So we have kind of an even mix of folks who are newer and folks who have been doing this for a while. You're probably going to hear this content slightly differently. So for those of you who are here newer, you're going to be listening to the practices content most specifically, thinking about what it actually means to be doing PBIS in the classroom. For those of you who have been here for a while, you better know that part, right? So that's the part that's really fluent for you. So you're here to listen to how do I actually help other people do this in their classrooms? How do we take this and implement it school-wide, district-wide, and is anyone here working at the state level? A few. So how do we think about at the state level how we can support and set up districts to really best support teachers in their schools, right? So depending on where you're here, you're thinking at different levels. The other piece is we know no matter how long you have been doing this, you might be at different phases of implementation, either with PBIS as a whole framework, or perhaps specifically with getting it into your classrooms. So how many of you, when you were initially trained in PBIS, kind of got the school-wide version that somehow wasn't quite as intense on classroom settings? So you did a great job with non-classrooms. I'm seeing hands. So think about the classroom pieces in particular with respect to phases of implementation. Not just overall PBIS, but where are you at? Are you just exploring this to think about how you're going to really emphasize PBIS in your classrooms? Are you invested, and so you're thinking about how you're going to install it? Or have you been doing it for a little while so you know what's really strong and where some weaknesses or roadblocks are, and you're looking to kind of continue to initially implement or really enhance and adapt as you're going into full implementation? So as we're going through this, think about the tools and strategies Lucille shared this morning that can help facilitate you taking content back. So the worksheet she introduced, be taking notes. You have our PowerPoint slides up through the app, so you can get them and take notes on the slides if you would like to. But think about how you're going to use the content. The other part that Lucille mentioned this morning, and again we'll mention a few times throughout, is we use data to guide our forum. So every year we plan very thoughtfully based on the prior year's data and based on current research and what's going on in the field. So I had the honor of organizing the classroom strands this year. So in particular, I'm really excited to see feedback on the sessions that are in the classroom strand, because those will help guide us about what we do in the future. So even though sometimes it feels like one extra step, please take the time to do the evaluations, because we truly do use your feedback and your data. And if any of you are able to make it to APBS, Heather promoted this really nicely in her keynote. It's a fantastic event. This year has the added bonus of being in DC. So we're hoping to get some federal level policymakers, decision makers in the room with us. And so the more we can share about the work we're doing, I think the better they will be prepared to hopefully enact policies and laws that are supportive of the work that we do as opposed to sometimes counterproductive. All right, so that's all of our setup. What I wanted to share with you a little bit about is what you're going to get in this session. So we'll start off, as I said, with an overview of practices. I'm assuming for many of you that content should be familiar. So I'm going to do it the fast way. I'll introduce what they are. The slides will have a little bit more detail than I will even go into, but all of the content is in your notes. It's also in a document that I'll redirect you to, because that will have even more detail than what the slides have. In the slides, there are a range of examples. So while I just said I'm going to do it the fast way, I might not go through all of them. The slides and then the documents I'll mention have a ton of examples. But what I really want to reserve time for is Cassandra's story of what it looked like in her district, because you will also see a range of examples there. And I think hearing it from someone who's living it and doing it now is so much more impactful than me talking to you about it big picture. So that's the setup for our morning. So we're going to jump in. How many of y'all have seen this document? Some, but not many. So I'm going to talk about it for a second so that if you want to, you can download it as I'm doing this. So this guidance document came out when the Office of Special Education Programs, so one of the arms of the Department of Ed federally, asked us if we would create a document to guide schools in how to react to problem behavior. But we're the PBIS Center, so we don't just talk about reactions, we talk about how to be positive and proactive. They asked us, even though we were the PBIS Center, to develop a guide without the acronym of PBIS. So when you go to this guide and download it, you will notice we had to create a new acronym, which is obnoxious. But we talked about positive classroom behavior support. So you all know that's a different acronym, but it means the same exact thing. So whenever you see those 4 letters, you can just swap them out in your mind for PBIS. It is the same exact thing. In this document, we went through a lot of detail about what do we mean by classroom management by doing PBIS or PCBS in the classroom. And so to do that, we talked about kind of what are the critical practices or critical features, and we tried to map them out, so this is called an interactive map, in terms of what things are foundational. So what should be there from the very beginning? What things are preventative? How do we respond? And then how do we collect data to know if we're doing those things in a way that actually supports our students? So under foundational, we talked about the physical arrangement, the routines, having expectations, and also explicitly teaching those in the classroom. Under prevention, we talked about active supervision, getting kids actively engaged with opportunities to respond, acknowledging students with specific praise and other strategies, and prompting and pre-correcting ahead of when behaviors were expected. When there were problem behaviors, we talked about error corrections and other strategies, and we gave some other examples of tools. The cool part about this guide, which hopefully I've talked long enough that those of you who wanted to could download it, is that you click on any of those and they're hyperlinked. So what it takes you to then is a table that describes exactly what that feature looks like. So what does it mean when we talk about settings? What are some examples of elementary school? What are some examples in secondary school? We summarize the research in like 2 or 3 bullet points so we don't make you bored, but we do at least let you know there's research supporting the recommendation. And whenever possible, we hyperlink to free resources. So videos, pamphlets, different things that you can download and use. We're having some fun with PowerPoints. Also, there's a self-assessment in the guide. So as you're looking through those things, you can self-assess what's going well, what's not. And on any of the items for the self-assessment, it also hyperlinks back to those same tables. So you can guide yourself through the self-assessment. And then there's a decision tree for what do we do when kids aren't responding to our classroom management, so that kind of responsive side. And I know these are screenshots you can't read. In a second, I'll show you PowerPoint versions you can read, but I just wanted you to be able to match to what's actually in the document. At the end, there are also some resources or tools that make it kind of quick and easy to talk about what we mean when we talk about responding to behavior. So we talk about responding fast, functionally, accurately, specifically, and timely. And we give a range of ways in which you can respond to behavior, whether it's appropriate, inappropriate, major, minor. We also end the guide with some scenarios. because I feel like often we talk about specific practices, and teachers leave not knowing how to put it all together. So there's a 3rd grade scenario and a 9th grade scenario, so whether you're in an elementary school or a secondary setting, it gives you an example of what it actually looks like to put all of those classroom practices together and implement them throughout the year. So there is a wealth of information in this guide. The PowerPoint slides are quick snippets from it, but this gives you a ton of the background detail. All right, so now in versions you can actually read on the PowerPoint. I mentioned the guide sets up this idea of what should be in place that's foundational. What are the positive and proactive practices you're doing to engage students during your lesson? And then what do you do after you've done your best with prevention to make decisions about how it's actually working? So thinking about the foundational practices, the first place we start is with the design of the classroom. How many of y'all can remember back to your first year teaching? So think about what that looked like, right? Just take a mental trip back. Think about the lessons you've learned since that very first day of your very first year on just the basics of how to set up a classroom, right? It's not that there's one magical layout that sets kids up for all successes and no problem behaviors. It's not that. But there are thoughtful ways to think about designing and setting up a classroom. And there are examples and some non-examples. But I will say, this is one of those things that I took to be common sense. Like, it didn't really occur to me that you had to train this as a skill set. And over the years, as I've worked with teachers, I've realized it's a skill set, right? Actually knowing how to set up a room, and then not just set it up initially, but adjust it based on student behavior across the year is a skill. As we talk about this and we see more and more examples on places like Pinterest, I feel like teachers start to hold themselves accountable for this like incredibly gorgeous graphic classroom. I feel like my Facebook feed this fall was peppered with classrooms that had like Harry Potter themes and different things. And I was just thinking, if I was still in a classroom, I would feel so overwhelmed by trying to kind of keep up with that. So just to be clear, this isn't that. You don't have to set up the most beautiful classroom. It doesn't have to be themed. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. It just needs to set your students up for success. So thinking about how you set up seating arrangements, if you build in a break area, those common things you know your students need, making sure the environment sets them up for that success. Second thing, having routines. If y'all stay back in your memory of your very first year, how many of you really nailed routines? You knew what kids were expected to do when they walked in the door, you knew what it was going to look like every afternoon when they were getting ready to leave, and you knew everything in between. Did anyone nail that on day one? I saw a couple yeses, but most of us did not, right? So if you think back to those first days and how you could set yourself up for success now, knowing everything you've learned since that very first day. When I go into classrooms that are really struggling, this is often a piece that's missing. So it's not rocket science, but it also isn't always common sense. Like, we don't always think about the importance of having a structure for our students. And not just having it in our head, but having it explicit. So having the schedule on the board, or if you're in a high school, maybe it's in a student's planner, but having a schedule that's explicit so not just you, but the kids know what's expected and coming next. The other part I think we sometimes forget as educators is taking care of ourselves within those routines. So if you think back to your very first year, and I always joke with my pre-service teachers because they don't know this yet, but you had to even figure out how to go to the bathroom. Like, thinking about how you were going to get things done within your routine doesn't come naturally. It's something you learned on the job. So how about we set people up for success by being really explicit, not just about kid routines, but also ours? How do we take care of personal needs? How do we make sure we make parent phone contacts? How do we deal with the adults who are coming in and out of our classrooms as related service providers, volunteers, whomever? Right? All of the routines that we have to manage, if we don't have a system in place to do that, we have to manage them every minute. If we set it up at the beginning, then we have a system in place that kind of takes over. All right, third one is around expectations. How many of you are in schools right now that are actively implementing PBIS regardless of the year? So for how many of your schools do you have a matrix that talks about your expectations within your routine, within your settings? And how many of you at the beginning of this year, so probably last month, how many of you taught those across the settings in your school? Awesome. And if you didn't raise your hands, that should be on your to-do list for this month, right? So making sure we don't just have the expectations, but we explicitly teach them. Now think to your classrooms. How many of you are in schools where at least 80% of your teachers have those same exact school-wide expectations defined in a matrix by their routines? Quite a few, but maybe not quite as many. So after you've got down the school-wide expectations, this is easy, in theory. The content you know, the way to do it, easy. But getting that into the classroom is a harder sell. How many of you know that 80% of your teachers not just have a matrix, but explicitly taught the expectations in the context of their routines? Fewer hands. So one of the mistakes we make in classroom is we either assume teachers are going to do it, or we have teachers who assume kids know it, right? That's your non-example. So in the classroom in particular, we know we also have to teach those expectations. So thinking about ways to make that easy and efficient and doable is a really critical piece of this work. All right, so after we've done our foundation, so we've got our design, our routines, and our expectations, we're now thinking about how we get kids actively engaged during our instruction. So the most research-based strategy we have out there that cuts across all content areas and all ages and developmental abilities, right? Every kid and every adult benefits from opportunities to respond, so ways to actively engage with learning. And there's a range of ways you can do that. You can make them fun, you can make them kind of group-wide, individual, you can make them varied across content, different response modalities, but the bottom line is you gotta do it. We want kids engaged, and not just occasionally, but every minute, right? Some of the best research out there talks about that higher rates of opportunities to respond can go as high as even 6 opportunities per minute, right? So when we think we're doing a good job, that's awesome, but we can probably even turn it up a little bit and help increase the engagement for our students. Quantity does not come at the expense of quality, so those of you guys teaching in high schools, don't only give short opportunities because you want to get a lot of them. Having kids actively engaged in a sustained way is also really important and really effective. Then when we're teaching, the other thing we want to do is catch things before they happen. Right? We don't want to wait for the errors and correct them. We want to remind kids ahead of time of what's expected. So as they walk into the door, or hopefully walk through the door, we're going to remind them what's expected for how they enter the classroom. We're going to remind them before we teach a lesson, before a new activity, what's expected, not waiting for them to make the first error. Right? And there's a range of ways we can do that. And after we've prompted and reminded them, following our instruction and ahead of the activity, we then actively supervise them during the activity to see how it's going. An active supervision looks like moving around, scanning, and interacting with kids, giving them some specific positives about what they're doing well, and correcting errors before they become significant. And all of these examples and non-examples that I'm going through really quickly are in the tables in the Supporting and Responding to Student Behavior Guide. So you're welcome to take pictures and take notes, but it's literally all there. So you don't have to worry as I'm going fast that you don't have the content, because you do. It's all there. The third thing is when kids are doing what we would like them to do, we catch it, right? And although sometimes we get into debates in PBIS about whether it's okay to have tangible rewards or not, and there can sometimes be strong feelings about that, the most meaningful way to catch behavior is specific praise, right? We do the extra bells and whistles because it helps us remember to catch kids with specific praise, but the most meaningful and most effective way to catch behavior for most kids, not all, but for most kids is going to be specific and contingent praise. Wow, I love how you're coming in quietly and finding a seat. Thank you for sitting and listening to me, right? And we're going to make it age appropriate, so for some kids it's loud and animated, for other kids it's private, but we are going to use specific praise to recognize behavior. And because that's maybe not going to be enough for every single kid, we're also going to use a range of other strategies to complement that. And I'm not going to go through all the other strategies in detail, but they are listed in that Supporting and Responding to Student Behavior Guide. And for all of these lists are not exhaustive. So there might be other things you're doing that are also effective. We just pulled those that had the strongest evidence base behind them. So in an ideal world, things are fantastic. There's no problem behavior, we've prevented, we've got kids engaged, we've been positive, and it's perfect. How many of y'all are in that classroom? right? So in reality, we can prevent and we can be positive and we can be proactive, but all kids from time to time are going to struggle, right? So then we have to ask ourselves a question about what do we do next? So what we did is we started the conversation where we started today. Not with, are the kids acting out? But the conversation started with, are the foundations in place? And are we engaging in positive and proactive practices? So those questions have to come ahead of this table, right? We have to set kids up for success before we can ask if they're being successful. But once we have all of that in place, we can say, is it working? Do we still have students who are engaging in problem behavior? And for most classrooms, the answer is yes, right? We never get 100% perfect. So for most of the time, the answer is going to be yes. Occasionally, we'll have somebody say, nope, my classroom is perfect. And I'll say, great, thank you, let's be honest. But thank you, that's fantastic. Keep your data going and come back to me if things change, right? So we'll encourage people to monitor. But for most of us, there's some level of behavior. So then the question is, what is it? What does it look like? Is it minor? And if it's minor, we have a set of strategies that I'll talk about in a second. If it's not minor, if you have significant challenging behavior in your classroom, then the question becomes how many kids are involved. If you are in a classroom where 80% of kids are engaging in significant problem behavior, what tier of an intervention is that? Tier 1, right? So my background was working in alternative education, where the school I directed had all kids who engaged in violent and aggressive behavior. So it's not to say that tier 1 shouldn't be intense. But tier 1 should meet the needs of 80% of your kids. So as you're thinking about classroom management, if you're in that year where you're thinking, oh my gosh, I have like 20 out of 25 kids who need behavior plans, maybe you have a really intense classroom. But that then tells you you have to beef up your tier 1 to meet the intensity of needs of your students. And because we don't all have all knowledge around behavior, it's okay to ask for help. So how many of you are in buildings where you would feel comfortable if you were in that situation? You got the toughest class because you happened to be on the PBIS team and know behavior, and you were struggling. How many of you were in a building where you would feel comfortable asking for help? That's fantastic. So in some of the times I've asked that question, people have said no, that they are in a building where they feel like they would be punished for asking for help. So this is why, and it's not the content of this session, but there are other sessions, we will talk about how important it is to live PBIS for your staff so that this becomes a doable thing, right? You need to be comfortable asking for and accessing resources. And sometimes it is not just a tier 1 issue, but you've actually identified kids with intensive needs. Also okay to ask for help there, right? That is no longer a tier 1 issue, although tier 1 needs to be intense to meet their needs, but it might be that they need more support layered on top of that. So with all of those things together, we have now kind of thought through the support students need. I mentioned one particular one. If you have kids engaged in problem behavior that's minor, your most effective management strategy is a quick, specific error correction or redirection, right? So just like specific praise, this is part of good instruction. And when we think about managing behavior or teaching social skills, I just had a conversation with someone just yesterday who was talking about when she trains this content, she asks teachers to think through how they would handle it if a student made an error in math, which is an example I often give, but she went further than that. So she said, okay, so not just what if a kid has an error in math, so if a kid says 2 + 2 is 5, you would do a quick error correction. But in addition to that, she made the point of, well, what if a kid keeps making the error? What if they're struggling with all addition, or all subtraction, or all calculus? What if the kid keeps making the error? What do you do? And you don't have to answer out loud, but in your head, most teachers would say, well, I have this strategy. Well, what if that doesn't work? I have this strategy. What if that doesn't work? And they can usually list 6 or 7 interventions that they would put in place to address an academic skill need. So the message is specific error corrections for a behavioral issue, but also thinking about it as you would an academic challenge. What are the other interventions that you would put in place for an academic error? And what are the interventions you would put in place for a behavioral error, right? So there are a range of other strategies we can use. They should also include reteaching. So these are consequence-based strategies, and they're described in detail in the guide. But the bottom line is we should be thinking about correcting behavior in very much the same way we think about correcting academics, even though it might feel different to us, right? These practices are actually very similar. So with that, I have set us up to give Cassandra most of the time for our session, and then our plan is to come back together toward the end and do a little bit of a debrief. So listen for examples. She'll be fantastic at sharing her district story, but putting it in a broader context. And as you think about how it applies to you, you can also ask questions for that. So with that, we will transition. And I think Cassandra has a mic, so we'll transition the mics too.
All right. Good morning. Thank you. How's the mic? Is it on? Oh, there it is. So my name's Cassandra Townsend. I am a special ed director at one of the schools in the district that I am currently in, Champlain Valley School District in Vermont. I also am the district director of behavior systems. In a state like Vermont, we wear many hats. A little bit about my journey to how I came here with Brandi. So I went to a school in Vermont, and I started out as a behavior specialist. And in Vermont, I was part of one of the first schools in Vermont to implement PBIS. I implemented and I fell in love with it. I drank the Kool-Aid, if you will. And then I was recruited actually to work for the state PBIS implementation team in Vermont. So I spent about 10 years being a sponge and absorbing all of the knowledge from Brandi, all of the knowledge from Rob and George, all the gurus out there, and helped our schools in the state of Vermont implement PBIS. After that, I decided, even though I had 2 little kids, why not go get my doctorate? So I decided, I'm actually currently enrolled at the University of Vermont in Ed Leadership and Policy. And now I'm actually back into the school system because one of the things that I have found valuable is taking all of this theory and research and thinking about how do we apply it practically with all of the competing things that we have in our schools every day. So my job this morning is to really share with all of you how we take all of this wonderful evidence-based practices for positive outcomes for our students and really show you an example of how we've implemented in our district. It would be poor form for me to start a presentation without some acknowledgments. And so I'd like to acknowledge the PBIS Technical Assistance Center. They have been an amazing resource for us in Vermont. The PBIS state team, we are a state who has a PBIS state implementation team. So that is supported by our Agency of Education. We have the Center on Disability and Community Inclusion in Vermont. That is where our PBIS center is housed. So we have a lot of support from the University of Vermont as well. And then I also want to thank my district for allowing me to escape my many hats and be here with all of you today. So just to set the context, Vermont is cold. It is small. It is rural. So when I'm speaking to you today about our implementation efforts around classroom behavior practice coaching, it's really within that context. Context does matter. So I will share my specific context, but when you're thinking about the ideas and the thoughts and the journey that our state and our district has gone through, think about your own context, because that is incredibly important. Vermont population, we're not that big. We have cities that are bigger than this. So again, in terms of the context, Vermont is very much a local control state. As many of you, I know in this morning, Heather talked about 67 districts and 67 school districts and 60, it matched up. Well, here we've got 308 schools in Vermont. We have 53 supervisory unions. That number has actually gone down. We used to have so many local school boards that were separate from all the different entities in schools in our state. But what's really exciting is in Vermont, because we are a smaller state, we've done some pretty big things. Over 50% of our schools in Vermont are implementing PBIS. It's really cool. So we've been able to, within the context of Vermont, move from initial implementation to fully implementation, and many of our schools are sustaining for years and years to come. So PBIS in Vermont, this is our data. You'll see a lot of data from Vermont. Again, that's part of that tattoo you have to get, right? The data, systems, and practices. This is showing just in a snapshot a couple of years ago, sort of our state level data around classroom referrals, office discipline referrals, as well as all locations except the classroom. This bar is something we created because it's helpful for us when we're making decisions and really allowing us to decide where we need to focus our efforts on. So at first glance, how many of you have used Swiss, if I could see a show of hands? Okay, wonderful. For those of you who don't use Swiss, I would highly recommend it. It's super easy, and you have access to data at the push of a button. I don't do any work for Swiss or anything, but just thought I'd promote that. But what you can see here is oftentimes you get these graphs, and you'll see classroom management or classroom location is one of the highest locations for office discipline referrals, right? That makes a lot of sense. That's where students are. Students are in the classroom the majority of the time. But what's really fun is look up all the other classroom, all the other environments, all the other locations. Add those up, put it next to your classroom, and it's really cool. You get a bar graph showing all locations except classroom, and then classroom. So in Vermont, we really realized that yes, while all students do spend most of the time in the classroom where they should be, we still needed to focus on classroom management, PBIS in the classroom. So we used that data, and the state used that to support this work. So why is this important? 12% of public school teachers leave within the first 2 years. I don't know about you all, but when I was in school, I got a 40-minute lecture on classroom management or classroom practices. Most of our experiences were in the field, right? We don't want people to leave our schools. What we know about kids, our most vulnerable kids, they need consistency and they need relationships. If we have people committing, that people with lots of energy coming into our schools, and they're not prepared, and they leave, that's pretty significant in the life of our most vulnerable students and our students who need the most supports. So again, this is important. This is something that we showed to all of our teachers in our district to really highlight our rationale for moving forward with this classroom work. And this is just a little bit about our district. Again, this is we have a small district. We have one high school, 5 K-8 schools, not many students compared to where many of you are probably from. But this work begins with a belief. It's a paradigm shift, and you'll hear that. You'll hear that when you're implementing PBIS within an MTSS framework, we're keeping kids in the classroom. That's where they should be. That's our philosophy. So we believe that good teaching, in addition to classroom management, has and leads to positive student achievement and outcomes. So as a district, as we were embarking on this work, we really needed to get on the same page in terms of what do we believe is good for kids. We also believe that relationships are at the heart of classroom culture. I just had to put a plug in. There's my son, Henry. That was him at summer camp. He fell in love with his swimming teacher. He brought her flowers on the last day. Okay? But that's what we want to see. That's why we are in this profession, because we're here to build relationships. So we need to prioritize that. And prioritizing relationships means keeping kids in the classroom and not having somebody else have a conversation with them if a problem behavior occurred. That may need to take place, but again, we need to build that relationship. So our PBIS journey in our district, we have all of our K-8 schools are implementing PBIS now. It was a journey. Our first school implemented in 2006, and we've had other schools implement along that continuum of 2013. All of our schools are implementing currently with fidelity. So when you heard about all those fidelity tools, the benchmarks of quality, the tiered fidelity inventory, TFI, we use those to assess how well we're implementing PBIS universals. We also have a statewide acknowledgement system. So you'll see we have some of our schools have received merit ribbons, which means they're implementing with fidelity. And then we have some of our schools receive exemplar ribbons, which means they're implementing with fidelity and able to show positive academic outcomes. All of our K-8 schools have engaged in classroom behavior practice coaching, thanks to Brandi and her support. So this is just a quick data snapshot across all of our schools in our district showing that yes, while non-classroom settings, problem behavior does occur, we still need to focus on classroom management. The first thing I want to talk a little bit about is when we talk about the classroom is part of our school-wide system as well. So we really need to make sure, because our students are embedded in classrooms the majority of the time, we want to be very intentional that when we think about enhancing our classroom management, our classroom PBIS, we want to make sure we're implementing with fidelity. So we start with the data, and I'm going to go through these slides relatively quickly to get to the classroom. The data tells us this is one of our schools. We took the Swiss data, it's the triangle report, and made decisions. We said, gosh, we were implementing PBIS, okay, 80% of our students, that's the green, were pretty successful with universal interventions. The yellow represents the 10% to 12% of students who may need targeted supports. That's also 2 to 5 office discipline referrals. And then we had the red is really students who may need intensive levels of supports, 6 or plus referrals. So what we found is that looking at our data over the years from 2008 and 2009, all the way over to 2016, 15, 16, 16, 17, we really increased the number, not in a good way, but the number of students that had received 2 to 4 or 5 or 6 or plus referrals. So we said, what's going on? We need to shore up our universal practices because really, we went downhill. That was our trend. This was a trend for one of our schools. So then we took it to the next step. We looked at our data. The PBIS leadership team in this particular school completed the benchmarks of quality. That's your leadership team self-assessment to determine whether or not the critical features of PBIS are in place. So we did this assessment. The school staff also did an assessment. For those of you who are new to PBIS, I know there are several of you out there. This is the self-assessment survey. We hand this out to all of our staff. It's very quick, and the staff rated to what extent these PBIS features are in place and whether or not they're a high, medium, or low priority. So we decided to compare the two because we got a small group of people having a conversation about how they think PBIS is going at the universal level. Then we're going to get the entire staff to let us know. So what we did is we looked at both of those, and we found that the acknowledgement system was lacking. The leadership team said, oh, we're not really great at feedback, giving positive feedback, and the school said that as well. So one of the things we did, we had the staff get together, and they told us, we got their opinions around what worked, what didn't work. Why are we not having a positive experience? We used to have a ticket system. This school used to have a ticket system, right? They said that in 7th and 8th grade, this is K-8 school, tickets don't work. We don't like them. The kids don't like them. The teachers don't like handing them out. They told the leadership team, our school-based PBIS leadership team, that they wanted it to be simple. They wanted it to be sustainable. They wanted it to connect with our school-wide expectations, as they should. They also said no tangibles. This is really tricky, because as Brandi said this morning, tangibles aren't really for the students. They're for us. They're for us to remind ourselves to give behavior-specific feedback. Behavior-specific feedback, okay? So that was tricky. They also said in a K-8 system, we want them to be developmentally appropriate, right? And we really are a responsive classroom, developmental design school. We do PBIS, but we want to combine the two. We don't want to think about them as separate. We want them to be unified under PBIS and the MTSS framework. So then out of that, really quick, the team got together. They said, you know what? We're going to change and tweak our expectations. We're going to use the penny. So right now, this school's slogan at CCS, taking care of ourselves, taking care of others, and taking care of this place, our school, it just makes sense. One of our school counselors came up with that, so a little play on words. This is what it's called. This is our logo. This is, you'll see, in all the hallways, in all the classrooms, everywhere in our building. And then this is where context is really important. So for those of you new implementers of PBIS, you got to keep it fresh, got to keep it new. You might have to tweak it based on what your data is telling you. Our school is a very sustainable school. We have composting, we recycle everything. That was a huge value in our school. So we brought that to the table. We said, we want the penny. Why we picked the penny? People don't really like pennies, it seems. Actually, there's a campaign out there to save the penny. I don't know if you've heard of that. But the penny is sustainable. It's a sustainable practice. It's a token. It's a reminder that we can reuse. There's several educational opportunities for using the penny as your tangible. And then one of the things this particular school really valued was, well, what do we do with the penny? We want to pay it forward. We want to pass the penny along to our community. So what this particular school did to shore up the acknowledgement system is think about the penny, and this is the journey. If a student engages in one of our school-wide expectations of taking care of ourselves, taking care of others, taking care of this place, they are acknowledged with a penny, with behavior-specific feedback. It's got to be immediate. Then it goes into the school-wide penny jar or penny bank in the lobby. And then what we do is at the end of the year, and this school is going to do it twice this year, they're going to donate to a local organization the money that they've earned for their positive behavior. And it's not paying kids to be good. Just want to clarify that. We felt this particular school felt that it was really incredibly important to link that their individual student behavior not only has a positive impact on the school, it has a positive impact on our community. So that was huge for this particular school. In the classroom, this dives into sort of how the students get it in the classroom. Again, connecting your foundational PBIS efforts within the context of a classroom. When students demonstrate the school-wide expectations, all of our classrooms have a mason jar. They put their penny in the mason jar. Students do that. Once the classroom mason jar is full, then it goes into the school-wide penny bank. And what's really great is in our school, again, the context, our teachers wanted a significant level of autonomy. They didn't want to be told when we're going to have a celebration. They didn't want to be told, what is the celebration going to look like? We value student voice and student choice, and so one of the things we did is really make sure that teachers had the mason jar, but it was up to the class, the individual class and the students to come up with what is the benchmark, what is the line in which we're going to have a celebration, and every classroom was different. They had different red lines, and then they also had an opportunity to decide authentically as a community, building relationships, what is our celebration going to look like? After this happened, this particular school went to the staff with data again. I can't emphasize the importance of always going back to your staff with data. It's that feedback loop, making sure we're getting the feedback and sharing our data with our staff. So this is what was the outcome. If you looked at the self-assessment survey here, On the left, that was last year's self-assessment survey, and it was very low. Remember, that's what drove the PBIS leadership team to really focus on the acknowledgement system. And then this was last year's data. So you can see the growth between last year's staff perspectives and perceptions around the acknowledgement system compared to this. So this was something we celebrated as a staff. And it also led to an increase in buy-in for staff because we were working collectively as a school to make improvements for our students based on data. What we also discovered is as we were doing this, our office discipline referral rates went down. So we revamped some of our response systems that Brandi highlighted earlier. You also have to have those. We revamped those. We pre-taught. We did a lot of pre-teaching and pre-correction. Then we rolled out the new acknowledgement system, and the overall trend line was pretty awesome. Compared to last year, the year before this, the bars were much higher. So we did a comparison, and we were able to show staff that based on their adult behavior change and effort to acknowledge students with positive behavior-specific praise, we actually saw outcomes for students. Our students were in the classroom more. Next, I want to talk a little bit about once the foundational classroom, once the foundational school-wide PBIS is in place in the classroom to begin with, how do you then enhance it? And we had the opportunity to work with Brandi as part of the state PBIS team and implement some of the practices that Brandi highlighted. So my job now is to show you what those look like in practice and actual. So many of you may have seen this research. I often show this to my staff and all of my schools because research really supports the coaching model. This is research from Joyce and Showers showing that you can train and hope all day long, which is I stand here, I talk, I hope that you go back and implement what I've said with fidelity, right? But what Joyce and Showers discovered is that does not lead to any sort of classroom application, long-term impact. What does lead to that is embedding coaches in our schools, in our classrooms to support each other in implementing the practices. And so that's what we did through the work with Brandi. We currently, in 4 of our K-8 schools, we have identified behavior systems classroom practice coaches. We're still trying to figure out a name that fits the context of our school. There's a lot of acronyms, so we're trying to figure that piece out too. But essentially, this is the team that was trained with Brandi and colleagues from UConn to think about what are the practices and systems that we need to embed in the classroom to enhance our school-wide PBIS efforts. We started with a few assessments that Brandi highlighted, and they're also in the guide that you referenced as well. So self-assessment. First, we needed to decide, is this a priority of our district to engage in this type of work? In our district, we have literacy coaches, we have math coaches. It seemed logical. Why not a classroom behavior systems coach? If we're equating academics and behavior as equally effective in terms of the positive impact they have on each other, then we really need to prioritize having skilled people in our buildings as peer coaches. So that's one of the things we did. So we got from all of our schools, from our admins, from the district, we said yes. We want to move forward with this work, and we want to prioritize it. The next thing we did a little sampling, a survey of our teachers, because we need to know what they know or what their perceptions are around classroom management practices. So we took the survey and put it on a Google form. It was easier for us to get the data. And what we found is that, this is data from one particular school, what we found is that the majority of folks said, yeah, I post the schedule and routine for the day. I do that. And we have evidence of that. So not only are the teachers saying they do it, we went around and we said, what's the evidence? Can you show me? That's awesome. You've got that posted. So again, this is one school. The school-wide expectations at the top. You see routines. We know this. As much as children want to buck the system, they crave routine and structure and a predictable learning environment. So we need to make sure that we're attending to that. So we looked at that. We said, that's great. Another question we asked our staff in this particular school, do you arrange your room, in an effective way that's appropriate for your activities? So they answered this question. And this was the response. We had about 80% of our respondents say, yep, we do that. Some of them said partially. Nobody said no. Again, self-assessment, we'll see. And so again, we looked around. We looked at our schools. We said, okay, let's see, what does it look like? So in many of the classrooms in this school and other schools, they think about creative ways that students can move around without disrupting the environment for others. Some of our students just need to move. So how can we do that? We put yoga balls as chairs. We have one classroom a couple years ago, got a grant, took away all the classroom chairs, and everyone sat on a yoga ball. It was awesome. The kids loved it, the teacher loved it. She found that students were much more engaged in the content. And then just making sure that, again, you see over here the routines, there's alternative seating, you sit on the floor, sit in a chair, those types of things. Then we asked the teachers this question. I post a small number of positively stated expectations on the wall, and the majority as well. This was partially for many of the staff here, about 32%. Again, it's a small n, but 32% said partially. So we decided to look around as well. And most of them do have the expectations posted. It's always a work in progress. So for those ones who said maybe partially, we've got to go back and do some peer coaching. We really need this in your classroom. And then we looked at some of the other questions on this survey that we gave to staff. And what we were looking for was what are they telling us they're not doing to drive what we should be doing? Okay. So what we discovered is praise and opportunities to respond were the two areas where teachers were self-assessing, saying they don't do really well. Some not at all. So we, as behavior practice coaches, classroom coaches, said, well, what are we going to do about it? So what we've discovered in our district and in many of our schools is an influx of initiatives and different practices and programs, some evidence-based, some not. We decided to do a little bit of an inventory of what are the practices within the classroom that our teachers are already using, and how can we leverage those practices to increase and to teach about opportunities to respond and praise. So one of the things we wanted to do is many of our schools are implementing responsive classroom, developmental design. We're implementing to some varying levels of degrees, second step, Kelso's choice, zones of regulation. So a lot of these things are happening in the classroom. So we discovered it's really important that we identify what's working and integrate and align and not keep them siloed, because you can get really muddled in those silos. It gets really complicated fast. So we use responsive classroom and developmental design, particularly in this case at one of our middle schools, developmental design for the older students, middle level. Talk to the teachers around how to give behavior-specific praise through what they're already doing and already know about in terms of the acknowledgement starters. that developmental design. So it's not separate. We're not asking teachers to do anything they're not doing. We're basically connecting the dots. You're already doing this. We're finding that you're telling us that you're not doing some pieces of it. How can we make the connection? How can we bridge those two? Another example of this is the one thing we did. We used responsive classroom language and our PBIS expectations to create feedback scripts for our staff. Now, this was really helpful. I noticed, thank you. We also had a little thing that said, you know, again, one of our slogans is assume nothing, teach everything. Okay, so even this is a handout for staff, not students. And at the top it says, rather than saying a global good job or nice work, tell students what they specifically did well so they know what to keep doing and build upon. Okay, so really being explicit with your staff, what you're looking for. And then what we know, we did a lot of teaching with the classroom and the whole staff around what we know about behavior-specific praise. It has to be immediate. You can't just wait a week and say, hey, remember that time when you held the door for Johnny? That was really taking care of him. Because the student, as we all know, they won't remember. They probably won't remember. It needs to be contingent on an observation, a direct observation. It needs to be specific, and it needs to be sincere. Our students are amazing at identifying when you're not being authentic and when you're not being sincere. And they will call you out on it sometimes. So that's really important. So then what we looked at opportunities to respond. We did this example for our staff. We said, well, give us some examples of how you do some verbal responses. How do you do nonverbal responses? What do they look like? Choral responding, guided notes, all of these practices and strategies for increasing opportunities to respond. What are you currently doing? And we had our staff reflect on that. That is where we currently are right now. Now, this is a journey, so I've just shared with you a piece of the journey that we're on. We have a long ways to go in our district. I have a lot of work to do as a district coordinator of this effort. But really, what we're looking at now as we move forward in enhancing PBIS in the classroom is looking at the data, having teachers reassess their perceptions around what features they're implementing and not, and then really expanding it. The one thing that I've learned from this process, for just a piece of advice, is one of our best behavior classroom coaches is a classroom teacher. Very receptive when standing in front of people, when you live this every day of your life and you're in your classroom every day. For us, it was really helpful. They're all wonderful people, but it was really incredibly helpful to have somebody who lives the classroom teaching experience to be that peer coach. So, thank you.
So I get to do a quick recap, but before Cassandra takes her mic off, are there any questions that were maybe specific to her example or that you wanted to ask about how her learning might impact what you want to do in your school or your district? Yeah.
Specifically to the classroom teacher as a coach or peer coach, what does kind of it look like, their responsibilities during the day? Where do they find the time outside of the instructional time to be able to do that as a peer coach?
So I'll repeat the question and then you can answer it. So the question is, when you do have a classroom teacher as the coach, how does that work? How do you fit it into their role, the logistics of that? How do you manage that role as a classroom teacher?
That's a great question. That particular classroom teacher, so in our school district, we have an embedded model. So she is part of a co-teaching team with a special educator. So that is one avenue that she's been able to utilize some time. The other thing is, as a district, we have implemented professional development time in our daily schedule once a week for folks to connect with each other. This is embedded. We have a shorter school day on a Tuesday, and we dedicate 2 hours every Tuesday to professional development, and that's primarily the opportunity for that particular teacher to share and coach her peers.
Yeah, and I see a question from the gentleman in a blue shirt.
That classroom self-assessment tool that you mentioned in your presentation, is there a place we can go to find that so that we may use something like that?
Yeah, so right now there are a bunch of different checklists that exist and live on PBIS.org. So there's one that's embedded into the Responding and Supporting and Responding Student Behavior Guide. I almost said it wrong, the one that I showed you earlier. There's another one that is a self-assessment, and Cassandra used one I think that actually came out of a book. They all sample about the same kinds of content, at least the ones on PBIS.org. Our hope is that within the next year or so, we'll have one that's integrated into a national website, like, say, PBIS apps. But right now, it's kind of paper and pencil version, unless you set it up as a Google Doc, which was fantastic.
I used Google Form, which was really helpful to help me generate those graphs.
The content is at PBIS.org, and if for some reason you have a hard time finding it, our email addresses are in the PowerPoint, so feel free to shoot us an email and we can send it to you. Other questions before Cassandra sits down? Yeah?
Is there, do you have people that this is all that they can say that it's just like you mentioned, the literacy coaches, the math coaches, are there people now that this is all that they do?
So the question is, are there people where this is their only job? So it's all that they're doing.
That's a great question. We're moving towards that endpoint. That's what we want. That's the vision. We need to prioritize these positions in our school.
And further thinking, will universities be having a curriculum for perhaps?
So our university is going to step up with pre-service teaching. She said it much nicer than I just did, but...
I can speak to the University of Vermont, having been there. They do have a couple of classes. It doesn't lead to a certification yet. That's also a vision, but at least we're getting some classes and seminars in there around PBIS and classroom.
All right, and another question?
At the beginning, I didn't get a chance to download the guide, and I was wondering if you could go back to give me that reference to the name of the guide and where to find the actual guide that you wrote.
Yeah, so the Supporting and Responding to Student Behavior Guide, this one, is up on PBIS.org. You can Google it. It'll be the first thing that comes up if you type in the name. But the way you navigate to it right now is when you go onto PBIS.org, there's a school bus icon that shows kind of the school-based content. You click on that. It has a drop-down menu. PBIS in the classrooms is, I think, the second click on that drop-down menu. If you were in the keynote with Heather, she actually showed you a screenshot of the classroom website. So it has Outcomes Data Systems Practices circles. Around the outside of it, it has guiding questions by role. So you can go right there. You can click on the Practices circle, and you'll get this. But it's also helpful if you're going to share this content with others, that if they're a teacher, they can click on the Classroom Teacher bubble. It'll give them some guiding questions that will help them understand whether their questions are related to practices, which is this guide. There are also companion guides for systems, which we used in the model that Cassandra was referencing, where we were training coaches. We had them think about the systems they needed to build to support the practice implementation. And there is a third guide on data. So you'll go to that, and you can then click to get any of those 3 guides, and they are kind of aligned, even though this one's the most graphically pleasing because the federal government made this one. The others we made, and they're slightly less graphic, but the content is aligned and good. Another question, yeah?
I was just curious, since a lot of the behavior happens outside of the classroom, do you have any components in place as far as training supportive staff, bus drivers, supervision aides, things like that? And is there a self-assessment survey for those staff members as well?
That's a great question. So we do have training opportunities for our paraprofessional staff during that Tuesday PD time. So we try to hit everyone in our school if they need that, whether it's in person or either scheduling another time to meet with them. We often have bus driver meetings in the morning. We bring donuts and talk about our school-wide expectations and how they can, what does it look like on a school bus. So we do try to embed those as well.
And there is a self-assessment. It's called the Active Supervision Checklist, or non-classroom setting system self-assessment, but it guides through some of the non-classroom setting pieces. It's not attached to these because it's in the non-classroom setting piece, but it parallels some of the content. It really goes in depth around the active supervision pieces that you need in those settings. Yep. At PBIS.org. And again, if you have a hard time finding it, Heather mentioned this morning we're going to redesign the website. There is so much information up there that, frankly, I sometimes struggle to find where it all is. So there's a search function in the PBIS.org website. You can search in it or email one of us and we can direct you where it is. Any other questions before I do a wrap-up? Not that you can't ask more questions after the wrap-up. I just want to make sure before Cassandra sits down. All right. Thank you so much. So although we're focused on practices this morning, I mentioned briefly that there is a systems guide. So if you were sitting through Cassandra's session and thinking, oh my gosh, this is amazing, and I don't know how it fits in my context because we don't have those same exact resources, or we have a bigger setting, or we have, right? The systems guide gives you the kind of framework for how to support teachers with a lot of flexibility. And so I thought that was a phenomenal example of how Cassandra and her district took that framework and made it fit their local context. So she walked you through how they use data to guide their decisions. But in that guide, it gives you examples of coaching as functions, not people. So there are examples that other districts in Vermont, who were part of that same coaching group, used self-management to have teachers coach themselves because they did not have the resources to have coaches in each of their buildings. There are other schools that use peer-based coaching models because, again, they don't have coaches, but they have a really strong peer culture. So in the systems guide that's the companion to this, we give a range of examples of how to support teachers that aren't tied to a specific resource model. So what we've started to move to in our trainings is not saying like whether you're going to do this or not, but the question is how are you going to do it? So kind of taking away the option of going into the classrooms. When I first started training PBIS and we would talk about classrooms, people would kind of shudder and we would just kind of back off of the topic. Now we dive in. It's not a question of whether we're doing it, it's a question of how we're doing it. So the systems guide helps give a range of examples for how, and you can choose the elements that fit your local school, your local district, or your state. So in the practices guide, shifting back, we spent time this morning just introducing the practices very briefly. Cassandra gave you, I thought, phenomenal examples of what they looked like in her district. And I'm going to continue to encourage you to go back to that document to see a broader range of examples, also non-examples, so common errors people make in implementation, and resources. There are videos of many of these that as you're thinking about how to take the content back, being able to show it is so much more powerful than just being able to talk about it. So for the foundations, we talked about the physical design, and there were great pictures. We talked about routines or schedules, and we saw, again, fantastic examples of that. And we said for all of these things, it's not Pinterest perfect. It is having it be functional for how you teach and for the learners you have in your classroom. And then getting the expectations from outside of the classroom and actively teaching them inside the classroom. So making sure that that connection is there. And I loved the example of how in many settings that means you integrate and align that with what's already happening in the classroom. Whether it's academic curricula, whether it's existing programs like Responsive Classroom, showing how these things connect so it's not one more thing, it's making you more effective and efficient with your time. During instruction, and again, fantastic examples of how to do this piece, getting kids actively engaged with opportunities to respond, and those are a natural place to connect into academic programming, because when I talk to my colleagues who do a lot of academic work, that's their go-to strategy as well. So that in particular is both an academic and a behavioral strategy. Prompts and active supervision are critical. As teachers, we do these things a lot, but we sometimes do them in the wrong order. Like we will say the words around, remember, we're supposed to raise our hand, but we wait until the kids have talked out to say them. So it's not saying say more or do more, it's just saying do it ahead of time so we can catch kids being successful and set them up for success. And when they are successful, catch them doing that well. And I loved the example of giving people a script for specific phrase, because it seems easy, but we have so many other things on our plates that giving people tools to do that is really helpful. And then finally, we use our data to guide decisions about what's going on in our classroom. So we talked about often there are going to be minor behaviors, but we have strategies to correct those. And the big message was around thinking about correcting behavioral errors in the same way we correct academic errors. We said if it's more significant and it's many of our students, we know that's telling us our tier 1 isn't strong enough. So not that that means we're a bad teacher, but we might need to get some support in how to enhance our tier 1, or we might need to just look at our own practice and collect some data on ourselves and think about where we can enhance and beef up. I loved the self-assessment data. You can't always trust that people know enough about the practices to be accurate, but in that example, they actually told them where it is that they needed work, and it helped guide their kind of district plan for professional development. And we also know that tier 1 is not enough for everybody, so we do need a plan to differentiate supports. So we're ending a couple minutes, 3 minutes early, so don't run out. Take time to use the QR code and do the evaluation. So as I said, we actually use these data to make decisions, so please take the time, not just in this session, but in every session you attend, to give us your feedback. And I will stop talking so you can focus on that, but have a fantastic rest of your conference. If you had questions you didn't get to ask this morning, there is a roundtable discussion question and answer session on Classroom this afternoon. So you're welcome to come back to that, and there's no content, it's all just question and answer. So we will see you throughout the day and this afternoon, hopefully, and have a fantastic conference.